The sea is a strange place after midnight. Too vast, too quiet, too indifferent to the lives drifting across its surface. On the night of May 14, 2017, somewhere in the dark stretch between Cuba and the Florida coast, a catamaran named Surf Into Summer cut through the water under the stillness of a moonless sky. It should have been an ordinary final night of a long overdue honeymoon, the kind of peaceful ending couples imagine when they picture a life they hope will last. But by the time the sun rose again, only one of the two people aboard that boat would still be alive. It had taken years for the story of that night to be pieced together. Years of interviews, search grids, forensic analysis, courtroom arguments, and the relentless grief of a family who refused to accept answers that never felt complete. And even now, with the case seemingly resolved on paper, there remains a lingering sense that the sea never truly surrendered its full truth. But some truths never hide completely. They leak out in fragments, through broken hulls, uneasy timelines, conflicting statements, and the quiet presence of things someone tried very hard to conceal. This is the story of Isabella Hellmann, a mother, a wife, a woman who vanished into the open ocean on a night when her life should have been safest, and a case that proved that sometimes real danger doesn't rise from the waves, it stands beside you on the deck. The day it all began, nothing looked like the start of a tragedy. Isabella was 40 years old, a Cuban-born American who had built a life for herself in Delray Beach. She had a condo she loved, a job in real estate that kept her busy, and a close family who saw her as someone whose presence filled every space she walked into. When she smiled, her sister once said, it felt like the room warmed up a little. She met Lewis Bennett online. He was also 40, a mining engineer from Dorset, England, with a complicated mix of Australian and British citizenship and a long list of miles logged at sea. Lewis was the kind of man who presented himself as confident and capable, the sort who told stories of far-off places and long voyages that could captivate someone like Isabella, who loved adventure but lived with her feet firmly on the ground. Their relationship sparked quickly, and by July 2016, they welcomed their daughter, Amelia, a baby who instantly became the center of their world. At least, that's how it appeared. By February the following year, Isabella and Lewis married. And a few months later, they set off on the honeymoon they had delayed for far too long, a voyage stretching from St. Martin to Puerto Rico and then to Cuba before returning to Florida. Friends would later say Isabella looked excited when she spoke about the trip. She wanted to come home with stories. She wanted to come home to her baby. That last part she repeated over and over again. On May 14th, while the couple was still in Cuba, Isabella used the satellite phone to call her sister. They were preparing for their final night on the water and would soon be heading back toward the Florida coast. Her sister remembered the sound of her voice, calm and content, relieved the trip was almost over. I can't wait to see Amelia, she said. She was already imagining walking through the door and hearing her daughter laugh. No one could have guessed that this would be her final call. According to Lewis, they set sail from Varadero around 5:30 p.m., the fading light falling behind them as the Surf Into Summer moved steadily across calm water. They ate dinner. They talked. And sometime around 8 p.m., Lewis said he went below deck to sleep, leaving Isabella at the helm. This is the moment every investigator would later circle, underline, revisit, and question. Because everything that follows depends entirely on what happened after Lewis says he closed his eyes. Just a few hours later, sometime around 1 a.m., distress signals began to pulse into the night. Emergency beacons activated. A call for help went out to the U.S. Coast Guard. A man's voice, calm but urgent, said he was alone in the water. His boat had struck something. It was sinking, and his wife was missing. When the Coast Guard arrived around 4 a.m., they found Lewis floating alone in a life raft. They found the catamaran submerged in the dark water. They found the signs of a vessel that had gone under fast. But they did not find Isabella. And, strangely, they did not find anything in the surrounding water that could have struck the boat. No debris, no hazards, no wreckage, nothing. By sunrise, the search for Isabella had already begun. Helicopters swept wide circles across the ocean surface. Boats combed the water. The Coast Guard covered thousands of square miles in a desperate attempt to locate her. They looked for her life jacket. They listened for distress cries. They scanned for anything. A movement, a shadow, a flash of color that could mean she was still alive. But the vastness of the sea does not always return what is lost. 3 days later, after countless passes across the deep blue nothingness, the search was called off. For most people, the grief would have been overwhelming. For Isabella's family, it was. They pleaded for help. They begged for continued searching. They cried for answers that never came. But Lewis? His reaction took a very different shape, a shape that investigators would later describe as concerning. When Lewis sat down with law enforcement after returning to Florida, cracks immediately began to appear in his story. He said he woke up when the boat hit something he could not describe, could not identify, and could not explain. When he went above deck, he said Isabella was simply gone. No sign of her anywhere. Investigators noticed how oddly detached the explanation felt. When they asked what he did next, the answer chilled them. Lewis hadn't searched for her. Not even briefly. He didn't call out her name across the water. He didn't fire flares to light up the area. He didn't circle the boat with a spotlight. He didn't scan the waterline or retrace the boat's movement. He didn't even leave the raft tethered to the catamaran while he waited for help. Instead, he cut the line, separating himself from the vessel before it sank. Why? He was asked. His answer: he feared he would be pulled underwater. But seasoned sailors, Coast Guard officers, and maritime experts would later point out something every professional at sea knows. Catamarans rarely sink to the point of pulling anything down with them. And this particular vessel, the Surf into Summer, was known to be extremely difficult to sink at all, unless someone wanted it to sink. When the Coast Guard photographed the submerged catamaran, something was unmistakably wrong. There were holes in the hulls, clean, neat holes, the kind that didn't match any typical collision. Experts noticed the break patterns and direction of the fiberglass spray. It appeared the damage came from inside the boat, not outside. And even then, the damage wasn't catastrophic. The boat should have stayed afloat if even minimal emergency steps had been taken. But then, investigators noticed something even stranger. The escape hatches had been opened. These hatches were below the waterline. No one opens them during a voyage. Opening them is essentially a death sentence for a boat. It guarantees rapid flooding. Experts were unanimous. The catamaran didn't just sink. It was made to sink. And once investigators began reconstructing the events of that night, one additional detail kept rising to the surface like a warning flag. Lewis had taken his time, nearly 45 minutes, to pack personal belongings before abandoning the vessel. A suitcase, 2 backpacks, peanut butter, trinkets, gallons of water, flares he would not use, emergency equipment he hadn't touched, and, buried among his belongings, something far more alarming: tube-wrapped collectible silver coins, hundreds of them. Coins later traced to a $100,000 collection stolen from a yacht Lewis once worked on. Suddenly, the story was no longer about a tragic accident at sea. It was about a man with stolen assets, a man with financial problems, a man who stood to inherit Isabella's condo, car, and accounts if she were declared dead. And that part, investigators noticed, Lewis pushed for almost immediately. Not months later, not after consulting with her family, but within days while the search for her was still fresh. What unfolded next would unravel the fragile story Lewis had tried to build, exposing a chain of evidence that, piece by piece, pointed towards something darker happening aboard that catamaran than anyone first imagined. Something far more deliberate. Something final. The day Lewis returned to Florida after being rescued, the shock and chaos surrounding Isabella's disappearance should still have been overwhelming. The ocean had closed over her without offering a single clue, and the search had only just ended. A grieving husband might have been expected to seek comfort with her family, to ask what more could be done, to cling to even the smallest possibility that she could somehow still be alive. But Lewis seemed focused on something else entirely. Within hours, he began suggesting that the Coast Guard issue a letter presuming Isabella dead. It wasn't something families usually request quickly. Most people wait. Most people hold on to hope, even if hope feels fragile. But Lewis was asking before the shock had even settled, before anyone could process what had happened. Investigators noted it. Her family noticed it, and quietly, it became the first moment that made them pause and wonder. Why the rush? When the Coast Guard refused, explaining they didn't have the authority, Lewis shifted his attention back to Florida, where he had left Amelia with Isabella's parents and sisters. The toddler had been surrounded by the only family she knew, a family trying desperately to protect her while dealing with unbearable uncertainty. But Lewis had already made plans. He booked 2 one-way tickets to the United Kingdom, one for himself, one for Amelia. He said he wanted to return to his parents' home. far from the place where Isabella had disappeared. But the timing, just days after the disappearance, raised questions. He hadn't asked the Hellmanns how they felt. He hadn't involved them at all. He simply planned to take Amelia and leave the country. When he arrived at Isabella's condo to pick up belongings, he accused her family of entering the home and taking items, an accusation they vehemently denied. The police were present during the exchange, recording every moment as tensions escalated. When Lewis confronted Isabella's sister, the raw grief in her voice sliced through the room as she cried out, "You killed my sister!" It was a moment no one forgot. Not the police, not the family, and not investigators who would later look back on it as an early sign of the widening divide between Lewis and the people who loved Isabella. But none of it stopped him. Days later, Lewis left the United States with Amelia and flew to England. He did not tell the Hellmanns. They learned afterward. Another deep wound added to an already unbearable loss. By the time Lewis was settling into family life overseas, the investigation back in Florida was moving fast. Federal agents examined everything retrieved from the life raft, every item Lewis had chosen to bring with him when he abandoned the sinking catamaran. The rescue swimmer had noted something strange during the rescue. One of the backpacks Lewis insisted on taking with him was unusually heavy. It was so heavy, in fact, that it was the one item Lewis clutched tightly as he was hoisted into the helicopter. That backpack was never searched, but everything left behind was. Inside the raft, agents found a jar of peanut butter, water containers, flares, a secondary locator beacon, clothing, Cuban souvenirs, and 9 plastic tubes wrapped in tape. Inside those tubes were 235 collectible silver coins. They weren't pocket change. They were part of a rare collection worth more than $4,000. Then agents searched Isabella's car parked back home in Florida. In the back seat, they found something even more startling: more tubes of rare coins and $220,000 in cash. That was the moment the investigation shifted. This was no longer just a missing at sea case. It now had intersections with theft, smuggling, and financial motive. When the photos of the coins were sent to the owner of a yacht called the Kitty R in St. Martin, the truth surfaced quickly. Lewis had once worked aboard that vessel, and a year earlier, a collection of coins worth $100,000 had mysteriously vanished from it. The owner identified the coins on site. The FBI now believed they had found stolen property Lewis had taken from the yacht before leaving St. Martin. He had flown under the radar with the coins for months until the night Isabella disappeared. In September 2017, federal agents arrested him. But this arrest wasn't for murder. It was for transporting stolen goods. It was the first real charge investigators could place on him while they pieced together the far more complicated question: what had really happened to Isabella on the water that night? While serving a 7-month sentence on the coin charges, Lewis made another move that investigators and a judge found deeply troubling. He filed a request in Palm Beach County Probate Court asking for Isabella to be legally declared dead. It had been only 5 months since her disappearance. Florida law requires 5 years. He was not even close. The probate judge, hearing the arguments, noted how unusual, how unnerving it was for a spouse to pursue a declaration so quickly. Most people hold off. Most spouses cling to hope for as long as possible. But Lewis was asking to unlock Isabella's estate almost immediately. Her condo, her car, her accounts, her personal property. When the judge asked why the rush, Lewis's attorney answered that assets were going to waste. The judge was unmoved. The request was denied, yet the attempt itself became a cornerstone of the ongoing FBI investigation. Prosecutors later said it was not only unusual, it was suspicious, because along with the financial motive, investigators were beginning to uncover a series of facts that painted a troubling picture of the final leg of the honeymoon voyage. First, the satellite phone. Lewis had not activated it until the boat reached Cuba, despite sailing through multiple international waters where an active satellite phone could be the difference between life and death. Second, the personal locator beacon. He didn't register it until the same moment, right before the final leg of their return trip to Florida. Experts later said this was the opposite of what seasoned mariners do. These are devices meant to be active before a voyage starts, not after nearly completing one. To investigators, it suggested something else: preparation. Not for a safe trip, but for a controlled outcome. Then came the most damning evidence of all: the catamaran itself. When the Coast Guard recovered images of the wrecked vessel floating upside down, forensic marine experts began analyzing the damage. The holes in the hull were not consistent with a collision. They were too clean. The fiberglass brake patterns radiated outward, not inward, indicating the force came from inside the hull. Even more damning, the placement of the holes was nearly identical on both sides of the catamaran. Accidental impacts are chaotic. They are uneven. They leave scratches, drag marks, crumpled edges, distortion. But these holes were symmetrical, purposeful, engineered. Someone had created them, and someone had known exactly where to place them so the vessel would take on water, slowly enough to gather belongings, but inevitably enough that the boat wouldn't survive the night. Still, even that wasn't enough to sink a boat like Surf into Summer. Catamarans are famously stable. With proper action, closing hatches, pumping water, identifying the breach, they can survive extensive damage. But investigators found that both escape hatches below the waterline had been opened. Those hatches were meant only for emergencies, moments when people needed to escape a compromised vessel from below deck. They were never meant to be opened during normal operation. Opening them would allow water to pour in freely. Opening them would doom the boat. Experts reviewing the photos stated that the vessel had been intentionally scuttled, not damaged, not hit, not destroyed, but deliberately sunk. The strongest evidence of all was the absence of evidence. The ocean around the wreckage contained no sign of any hazard, nothing that could rip two matching holes into a catamaran. Nothing that could cause a catastrophic, untraceable impact. Nothing consistent with the story Lewis told again and again. The FBI determined that the boat did not sink because of a collision. It sank because someone wanted it to sink. And the only person who could have orchestrated this was Lewis. But the question they struggled with was the hardest one of all. What happened to Isabella? Investigators never publicly speculated on the exact moment or method. They didn't need to. They had enough to prove intent, enough to prove preparation, staging, and motive. When Lewis completed his sentence for the coin charges, prosecutors were waiting for him. This time, the charge was far different. Second-degree murder. The case was built on evidence, inconsistencies, financial motive, the staged sinking, and the steps taken before and after Isabella vanished. Prosecutors described arguments in the marriage, conflicts over parenting, finances, and suspicion that Isabella had discovered the stolen coins. They argued that Lewis saw his wife not as a partner but as an obstacle, someone who stood in the way of the life he wanted, the financial windfall he pursued, and the clean, uncomplicated future he imagined overseas. Isabella's death removed every obstacle, but in the courtroom, the case took a turn. Instead of going to trial, Lewis accepted a plea bargain for a reduced charge, manslaughter. He was sentenced to 8 years in federal prison, the maximum allowed under the plea. As part of the agreement, Lewis forfeited all rights to Isabella's estate. Every dollar, every asset, every property would go into a trust for Amelia, the daughter who had lost her mother at barely 1 year old. The Hellmann family finally obtained a death certificate for Isabella. They sold her condo. They placed the proceeds into a trust. And they continued to fight for visitation, for updates on Amelia, for a connection that Lewis had severed the moment he fled overseas. Amelia remained in the United Kingdom with Lewis's relatives, but eventually video calls were arranged. Later, supervised visits, because even in the darkest cases, children hold pieces of two families, two histories, two legacies, two worlds bound together by tragedy. The ocean never gave Isabella back. Not a single trace of her was ever recovered. But what the sea kept hidden, the investigation eventually revealed. And the truth that surfaced was enough to tell the real story of a honeymoon that was never meant to return home. If you've watched this far, thank you for staying with me through this heartbreaking story. Cases like Isabella's remind us how many questions still linger beneath the surface. If you want to help keep these stories alive and support the work we do here on Unsolved True Crimes, make sure you subscribe, turn on notifications, and share this documentary so it reaches others who care about finding answers. Your support helps bring light to stories that should never be forgotten.